As Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, General Dwight Eisenhower had under his command the top military men in both Great Britain and the United States to assist him in working out the enormously complex plans for the long-awaited invasion across the Channel.
The directive from the combined chiefs of staff was simple, merely instructing us to land on the coast of France and destroy the German forces. The general plan, approved as the outline of the operation we intended to conduct, was land on the Normandy coast, build up the resources needed for a decisive battle in the Normandy-Brittany region, and break out of the enemy's encircling positions. Pursue on a broad front with two army groups, emphasizing the left to gain necessary ports and reach the boundaries of Germany and threaten the Ruhr. On our right, we would link up with the forces that were to invade France from the south. Complete the destruction of enemy forces west of the Rhine, in the meantime constantly seeking bridgeheads across the river. Launch the final attack as a double envelopment of the Ruhr, and follow this up by an immediate thrust through Germany, with the specific direction to be determined at the time. Clean out the remainder of Germany. The heart of Western Germany was the Ruhr. Nowhere else in Europe were there coal deposits equal in quality and so easily workable.
For generations, the Ruhr had been mined alternately by Germany and France, as control of the key territory shifted from one country to the other during the succession of Franco-Prussian wars. Each year, millions of tons of coal were mined in the Ruhr and fed into the maw of Germany's heavy war industry. Without the Ruhr's enormous output of coal, the German war machine could not have functioned efficiently. The huge quantities of material which had made Hitler's victories in Europe and Africa possible had their origin in the Ruhr. Now, as Hitler's grip on Western Europe was threatened by the Allies, Nazi war machines continued to pour in a steady stream from German factories, whose operation depended largely on the Ruhr. To prepare for the expected invasion, the Nazis began, early in 1944, to strengthen their Atlantic Wall. Its concrete and steel defenses dominated the beaches along the north coast of France. To German high commanders like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of North Africa, the Atlantic Wall seemed solid enough to withstand any Allied assault. The Nazi heavy coastal guns and the fortifications themselves were heavily camouflaged in an effort to fool any Allied inspection from the sea or air. On shore, the Nazis felt they were invincible. At sea, in the waters off the French coast, the Germans planted a profusion of mines to block the advance of Allied warships and transports. In the early months of 1944, nearly 1 million Allied soldiers arrived in the United Kingdom, swelling the potential striking force of Allied fighting men there to almost 3 million. The strength of the Allied air forces in the British Isles had grown from a few thousand planes in early 1942 to more than 15,000 planes of all types. The 5,000 Allied bombers in England were prepared to drop hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs in support of the invasion. The stockpile of vehicles alone for use in the invasion totaled hundreds of thousands of tons. Every available foot of space on overcrowded Britain was used for storage. Landing craft of all types were in readiness for the assault on the beaches.
We undertook a project so unique as to be classed by many scoffers as fantastic. It was a plan to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. This Mulberry unit was practically a complete harbor.
over the British Isles, experiments were being conducted with devices only recently developed for combating the German war machine.
The British set about the task of designing equipment that would facilitate destruction of German obstacles. They used the area at a secluded spot in eastern England for actual test of the equipment so developed. Heavy rollers for destroying mines were among the many items constantly under test. Senior commanders used every possible moment in visiting and inspecting troops. These visits, sandwiched between a seemingly endless series of conferences and staff meetings, were necessary and highly valuable.
The men who were to make the greatest assault in history trained exhaustively under conditions similar to those they would probably meet on the continent. The pre-invasion exercises were much tougher than the maneuvers they had known in the U.S., and the men took them much more seriously. The troops gained needed experience in coordinating their simulated attack with that of other units and operating as a well-integrated fighting force. Weapons like the bazooka, used for the first time in World War II, were carefully tested. And the men themselves were toughened up for the invasion in extensive sessions of hand-to-hand fighting. All our preparations were inspected in detail by the highest Allied officials.
In all our conferences, Mr. Churchill clearly and concretely explained his attitude toward and his hopes for Overlord. He gradually became more optimistic than he had earlier been, but he still refused to let his expectations completely conquer his doubts.
The paratroopers had been trained to peak conditions. Both mentally and physically, they were fit and ready to lead the assault on the enemy in France. Prime Minister Churchill and General Eisenhower were impressed with the performance of the paratroopers. The airborne force to be used in the invasion was the greatest up to that time. More than 13,000 men were to participate in the drop behind the enemy's lines.
The air plan, already in execution, called for the progressive wearing down of the Luftwaffe and the destruction of critical points in the rail and highway systems so as to isolate the coastal areas selected for assault.
The heavy air blows against the railroads in France began in April, about 2 months before the tentative invasion date. The bombing attacks against French rail centers were the first step in the disruption of the Nazis' communication system in France. Of course, our bombers did not always escape unscathed. The flyers realized that these military objectives in France must be intensively bombed, in spite of the considerable risks to our own air crews and planes.
The next combination of moon, tide, and time of sunrise that we considered practicable for the attack occurred on June 5th, 6th, and 7th. If none of the 3 days should prove satisfactory from the standpoint of weather, consequences would ensue that were almost terrifying to contemplate. The good weather period available for major campaigning would become still shorter, and the enemy's defenses would become still stronger. It was a tense period, made even worse by the fact that the one thing that could give us this disastrous setback was entirely outside our control. I was particularly pleased to secure the services of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay as the Naval Commander-in-Chief. He was a most competent commander of courage, resourcefulness, and tremendous energy. Moreover, all of us knew him to be helpful and companionable, even though we sometimes laughed among ourselves at the care with which he guarded, in British tradition and practice, the senior service position of the British Navy.
During the weeks before D-Day, General Eisenhower devoted as much of his time as possible to visiting the troops who were to participate in the attack on the Nazis' fortress of Europe.
At times, I received advice from friends urging me to give up or curtail visits to troops. They correctly stated that so far as the mass of men was concerned, I could never speak personally to more than a tiny percentage. They argued, therefore, that I was merely wearing myself out, without accomplishing anything significant so far as the whole Army was concerned. With this, I did not agree. In the first place, I felt that through constant talking to enlisted men, I gained accurate impressions of their state of mind. A favorite question of mine was to inquire whether the particular squad or platoon had figured out any new trick or gadget for use in infantry fighting. I would talk about anything, so long as I could get the soldier to talk to me in return. All southern England was one vast military camp, crowded with soldiers awaiting final word to go. The whole area was cut off from the rest of England. The government had established a deadline, across which no unauthorized person was allowed to go in either direction. Every separate encampment and every unit was carefully charted on our master maps.
The men prepared to go aboard ship. Some of the last-minute haircuts were a little on the close-cropped side. Many of the men had fathers who served in France in World War I, but never got any farther with the French language than Mademoiselle from Armentières. Their foresighted sons in World War II were intent on being a little better equipped for those leaves in Paris. Within a week, the troops would be storming the invasion beaches in the greatest military attack in all history. But with final preparations completed, there was time for a few days of relaxation. Finally, during the last days of May 1944, the all-important materiel was moved to the ships. The men were to assemble by the numbers of their ships, and all light vehicles and equipment which were to accompany the assault forces and their ships was to be identified in the same manner to avoid any possibility of a mix-up. On June 1st and 2nd, the troops left their camps and headed directly for the ports of embarkation under the strict surveillance of the military police.
The scheduled movement of each unit had been so worked out that it would reach the embarkation point at the exact time the vessels would be ready to receive it. As the time came for shifting our concentrations toward the ports, the southern portion of England became one vast camp, dump, and airfield. At our request, the British government stopped all traffic between this part of England and the remainder of the United Kingdom. The war-weary British public responded without a whimper to these added inconveniences and privations. The mighty host was tense as a coiled spring, and indeed that is exactly what it was, a great human spring, coiled for the moment when its energy should be released, and it would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted.
With D-Day set for June 5th, the weather turned suddenly bad the day before the scheduled assault.
Weighing all factors, I decided that the attack would have to be postponed. This decision necessitated the immediate dispatch of orders to the vessels and troops already at sea.
However, as the weather cleared, the decision was made to go ahead with the attack on June 6th.
Again, I had to endure the interminable wait that always intervenes between the final decision of the High Command and the earliest possible determination of success or failure in such ventures. I spent the time visiting troops that would participate in the assault. A late evening trip on June 5th took me to the camp of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, one of the units whose participation had been so severely questioned by the Air Commander. I talked to them about anything and everything. If men can naturally and without restraint talk to their officers, the products of their resourcefulness become available to all. Moreover, out of the habit grows mutual confidence, a feeling of partnership that is the essence of esprit de corps. An army fearful of its officers is never as good as one that trusts and confides in its leaders. I found the men in fine fettle, many of them joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry, since the 101st was on the job and everything would be taken care of in fine shape.
Striking forces in the most momentous assault of all time were the paratroopers, scheduled to drop behind the enemy's lines. The 175,000 men who made up the air and ground forces for the cross-channel attack arrived at the various ports of embarkation on the English coast by June 3rd, under heavy guard. The thousands of ships and small craft which comprised the invasion fleet were waiting in readiness to take aboard their human cargo. More than 4,000 ships and small craft were to ferry across the channel the men who were to land on the French coast on D-Day itself. To facilitate the advance of the troops once the invasion was launched, thousands of vehicles were loaded aboard the same ships which were to transport the men. On the days directly preceding D-Day, the southern coasts of England were alive with activity. The Allied invasion forces were bracing themselves for the mighty effort which at that moment was looked upon by many as the greatest military gamble in history. In spite of the vastness of the force of men and equipment involved in the attack, preparations for the departure of the assault units were conducted smoothly and efficiently. The last of the ships which were to participate in the D-Day assault were loaded to capacity, and the time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand. In the late afternoon of June 5th, D-Day -1, all preparations finally ended. The invasion fleet moved into the channel and made ready to assume the intricate pattern of positions from which, the following morning, the invasion of the French coast of the Nazis' European fortress would be launched. The moment all the world was tensely awaiting was now only hours away. The plan was for 3 Allied airborne divisions to land behind the beaches to cut Nazi communications and disorganize the enemy. Then, some 5 hours later, the first Allied invasion troops were to storm ashore on a 50-mile stretch of the French coast bordering the English Channel. D-Day finally dawned. The weather was favorable. The attack on the French coast was stepped up.
The air plan, already in execution, called for the progressive wearing down of the Luftwaffe and destruction of critical points in the rail and highway systems, so as to isolate the coastal areas selected for assault. For D-Day, the air forces were charged with the responsibility of demolishing selected targets in the enemy's coastal defenses, of providing overhead cover, and rendering general fighter-bomber support.
The Nazi planes that got off the ground didn't get very far. The area got just as thorough a going over as an important German industrial region. Allied pilots gave it the A treatment. In England, early on D-Day, gliders which were to carry GIs to reinforce the paratroopers were prepared for the takeoff. The first group of 51 gliders carried about 150 men, plus anti-tank weapons, to be landed before the beaches were invaded. In the early morning of June 6th, the first group of gliders was pulled off the ground and towed out across the channel, to be cut loose over the area where the paratroopers had dropped earlier. The small fields in which they were forced to land caused serious losses.
Report came from the airborne units I had visited only a few hours earlier and was most encouraging in tone.
San Mary-Glees was the first town to be captured by American paratroopers early on D-Day morning. In addition to seizing key spots to facilitate the advance of the major forces, the airborne troops proved invaluable as scouts. One of their most important functions was the determination of enemy strength throughout the French coastal provinces. Meanwhile, in the rough waters of the Channel, the giant invasion fleet was proceeding carefully toward the French coast, carrying the greatest amphibious force in history. Virtually every type of Allied assault vessel was pressed into use for the operation. The invasion armada had a complement of 4,100 ships and small craft, and carried 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles and weapons, and tons of supplies. In spite of close quarters in the Channel, the vast invasion fleet made the crossing successfully, suffering the loss of not a single vessel by German action. With all in readiness and H-hour drawing close, the men rededicated their efforts. The GIs and the Navy gun crews waited expectantly for an enemy air attack, but strangely, there was none. One of the most important and dirtiest of preparatory jobs was done by the minesweepers, which moved in and exploded mines just off the coast, clearing safe channels for the assault boats. Losses among the 200 minesweepers engaged in this hazardous mission were slight. The Germans, though surprised by our attack in relatively rough weather, were quick to contest the invasion. The coastal defenses, which they had spent years in preparing for this moment, were readied for action without delay. In the early morning hours, just before each hour, when Allied troops were scheduled to set foot on French soil, the showdown battle of Europe was begun. While the troops prepared to go ashore, the savage battle for domination of the beaches started. Allied warships trained their heavy guns on the German coastal defenses, which had not been knocked out by the Allied air bombardment. As usual, the destroyers, in closer to the beach, drew the enemy's fire. With their targets spotted, the warships went into action. While the battle raged on, the transports prepared to send their troops ashore. The men embarked calmly on the last leg of their trip. For some, this was their first time in action.
Prepare the cast-off!
After the planes and the warships had done their jobs, the final outcome of the mighty battle depended largely on the infantrymen. The GIs and the landing boats were fully aware that they were the center of attention. Springing to the defense of their European fortress, the Germans prepared to mass their strength in the area of our landings for a heavy counterblow. Somehow they hadn't been expecting an Allied landing at that exact time. For the troops, this was it. The British and Canadians, forming the British Second Army, landed on the left flank of the assault against determined Nazi opposition. On the right flank, the American First Army troops stormed ashore under heavy enemy fire. Our victory in World War II hung in the balance. Three American divisions poured ashore on Omaha and Utah beaches and fought desperately for a foothold. It looked like a tough battle ahead, with the issue very much in doubt. It was a tough battle, and American prospects for the immediate future were anything but bright. Casualties on D-Day were heavy, especially on Omaha Beach. 3,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, and missing on Omaha Beach alone on that first day. Along some of the beaches, landing conditions were highly unfavorable. Some of the landing boats were badly swamped, and the soldiers in them had a grueling time making the shore. They were in no condition at all to battle the Germans. Fortunately, the number of men who had to be pulled out of the rough sea was fairly small, and so the combat strength of their units was not seriously diminished. By D-Day afternoon, American artillery was ashore and in use. In the late afternoon of D-Day, some of the beaches were secured, and the troops began the drive inland to keep the enemy off balance. Every Allied advance was slowed down considerably by Nazi obstacles. The French coastal area had been liberally planted with mines, which the Nazis always believed in using plentifully. Our mine detection units reaped an abundant harvest in the country near the beaches. Although the offensive was hampered by the innumerable Nazi mines, the detection units cleared the areas quickly, enabling the troops to move forward without much delay.
Complicating the problem on the American front was the prevalence of formidable hedgerows in the bocage country. In almost every row were hidden machine gunners or small combat teams who were in perfect position to decimate our infantry as they doggedly crawled and crept to the attack along every avenue of approach.
In their drive up the peninsula toward Cherbourg, the GIs of the First Army, all veterans now, hammered at the Nazis without let-up. There were no large-scale surrenders, but enough prisoners were taken to supply Allied intelligence officers with up-to-the-minute information about the enemy. During the first week's fighting, Allied casualties mounted with appalling swiftness to thousands of dead, wounded, and missing.
As the conflict wore on, I grew constantly more bitter against the Germans, particularly the Hitler Gang. On all sides, there was always evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Every battle, every skirmish demanded its price in broken bodies and in the extinction of the lives of young Allied soldiers. Hundreds of broken-hearted fathers, mothers, and sweethearts wrote me personal letters begging for some hope that a loved one might still be alive. Every one of these I answered, and I know of no more effective means of developing an undying hatred of those responsible for aggressive war than to assume the obligation of attempting to express sympathy to families bereaved by it.
Wreckage littered the landing areas, particularly at Omaha Beach, where rough seas and very heavy German fire resulted in the disabling of quantities of our landing craft. On June 7th, the day following the first landings, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. The weather had improved considerably, thus making it possible for the Allies to follow up their initial success by quickly landing reinforcements and large quantities of materiel.
The period from D-Day to our decisive breakout was a definite phase of the Allied operation. From the day we landed, the battle never settled down, except in isolated spots, to anything resembling the trench warfare of the First World War. But it was the possibility of such an eventuality that we could never forget. Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job, and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not. All such predictions depended, of course, upon our success in maintaining the scheduled buildup. Landing tables provided in great detail for the daily and hourly arrival of given quantities of every kind of fighting unit, sandwiched in between the ammunition and other supplies which were required not only for the daily operations, but to provide the reserves to sustain continuous action once we should pass to the decisive stages of the battle.
With the historic Normandy landing successfully accomplished, the Allies took stock of their situation. On June 7th, D-Day +1, General Eisenhower and Admiral Ramsey, his naval commander-in-chief, inspected the landing beaches with an eye to the problem of landing the large additional forces needed for the big drive against Hitler's armies.
It was necessary to provide a means for sheltering beach supply from the effect of storms. To solve this problem, we undertook to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. One type of protected anchorage, named Mulberry, was practically a complete harbor. The principal construction unit in the Mulberry was an enormous concrete ship called a Phoenix, box-like in shape, and so heavily constructed that when numbers of them were sunk end to end along a strip of the coast, they would probably provide solid protection against almost any wave action. Elaborate auxiliary equipment to facilitate unloading and all types of gear required in the operation of a modern port were planned for and provided. The British and American sectors each had one of the Mulberry ports. Here, ships and landing craft could continue to unload in any except the most vicious weather. We had simultaneously to build up on the beaches the reserves in troops, ammunition, and supplies that would enable us within a reasonable time to initiate deep offensives with the certainty that these could be sustained through an extended period of decisive action.
As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use a miraculously short time after the men started work. The results of their efficiency were readily felt, especially by the enemy. Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces was the host for a tour of inspection of the area by several unexpected visitors from Washington.
I arranged to take General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, and a group from their respective staffs into the beachhead during the day of June 12th. Their presence, as they roamed around the areas with every indication of keen satisfaction, was heartening to the troops. The importance of such visits by the High Command can scarcely be overestimated in terms of their value to soldiers' morale. On that same day, June 12, 1944, the first flying bomb, known as V-1, reached London. The V-1 was a small, pilotless airplane which flew at high speed on a predetermined course and terminated its flight by means of settings in its mechanism. It contained a large amount of explosive which detonated upon contact, and the blast effect was terrific. The depressing effect of the bombs was not confined to the civilian population. Soldiers at the front began again to worry about friends and loved ones at home, and many American soldiers asked me whether I could give them any news about particular towns in southern England. The effect of the new weapons was very noticeable upon morale.
All anti-aircraft crews in the area tried to hit them in flight with some success. Every means at hand was used to try to explode them before they landed. In Germany, construction was being rushed on newer, more devastating weapons. In the final stages of its experimental phase, the V-2 rocket bomb was being readied for use against England. In early tests, many V-2s turned out to be failures. But after 2 years of experimentation, the rockets were performing well enough for leading German engineers to persuade Hitler that their use in large numbers against England would achieve wholesale destruction. The first non-experimental launching was set for late summer.
On June 19th, the hurricane struck us. It stopped for a period of 4 days nearly all landing activity on the beaches and therefore interfered seriously with every operation. During that time, sea communications between the United Kingdom and the continent were completely interrupted. On the day of the storm's ending, I counted more than 300 wrecked vessels above small boat size, some so badly damaged they could not be salvaged. There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches. To any other nation, the disaster would have been almost decisive. But so great was America's productive capacity that the great storm occasioned little more than a ripple in the development of our buildup. General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not.
The capture of Cherbourg, a major port, was a matter of immediate importance. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job expected stiff resistance from the defending Nazi garrison. Before our big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, American Cub planes again proved invaluable in spotting enemy strong points. Once their positions were spotted, our attack got going without delay.
Fire!
Cherbourg itself was strongly defended. But by June 25th, the first American troops forced their way into the city after a vicious battle and paved the way for the final capture. But first, the GIs had a last remnant of the Nazi garrison to silence. The GIs had to finish them off, one by one. Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. The area yielded some 39,000 Nazi prisoners, most of whom had fought stubbornly until confronted by American infantry patrols. These Nazis seemed surprised indeed to find themselves in Allied hands, and especially in such a short time. Their grandiose dreams of victory had never ended in such a humiliating spectacle. After several days, there were few reminders of the Nazi occupation. To the citizens of Cherbourg, life began again. The Nazis, in their customary fashion, had succeeded in pretty thoroughly wrecking Cherbourg. But the Allies now controlled a major port, which would enable them to deliver large quantities of supplies to the troops much more quickly. General Eisenhower was greatly pleased with the performance of the troops under General Bradley and Lieutenant O'Connell on the western flank in the Battle of the Beachhead. In their first real test on French soil, they had come through in fine style.
Montgomery's tactical handling of the British and Canadians on the eastward flank involved the kind of work in which he excelled. The morale of his forces remained high, in spite of frustrations and losses that could easily have shaken troops under a commander in whom they did not place their implicit trust. Caen did not fall to our initial rush as we had hoped. The battling in that area reached a sustained and intensive pitch. Rommel defended tenaciously.
For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assaults. After a month of steady bombing and shelling, Caen finally was taken by Montgomery's men on July 9th. The community, or what was left of it, was liberated at last, and the townsfolk no longer moved about in the shadow of the Nazi conqueror. The younger inhabitants, who had been children when the Nazis swept through France in 1940, were especially happy to be liberated. After the capture of Caen by the British, the advance of Allied forces on all fronts was slowed down.
The battle for position and of building up reserves progressed at times with disappointing slowness. There always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses and are meanwhile hearing their commanders criticized.
To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matter of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant that they would have to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Most effective morale builder for many GIs was a chance to renew their spiritual lives. To many GIs who had their faith to comfort them, even the prospect of death seemed easier to bear. Of course, there were moments which were not grim. In many of the liberated French towns and villages, the inhabitants were anxious to demonstrate their appreciation of deliverance from their Nazi conquerors.